that trust. All of a sudden, that Indian owner gets a letter from the county saying, you didn't pay your taxes, we're selling this, and you can get the proceeds from the sale.
So tax forfeiture was one way to do it.
Tax forfeiture was one way to do it. There was also a lot of intermarriage and other stuff that happened interculturally. So a lot of those individual allotments were then taken as well.
And this is hitting an ebb then in the 1910s, 1920s?
It ended in the 1920s with the Indian Reorganization Act.
Okay.
And so that was a part of the whole dealing with the economy at the time, restructuring and re-engaging under the New Deal. The General Allotment Act formally ended the Indian Reorganization Act formally ended the allotment process. In part also, there were a number of different studies that were done by the government, the federal government at that time, that really showed the devastating impact of these different allotments and how it impoverished so many different people. And so they ended that when the Indian Reorganization Act established a mechanism that fully recognized the existence of Indian nations for the first time under a formal American federal system, and proposed a type of constitutional government that most of the Indian nations in the United States adopted at that time. And a lot of the Indian nations organized with constitutions, with bicameral legislatures, with an executive office and court system. And so across the country you see Indian governments and Indian nations that are organized essentially along the same lines as the United States of America.
And occasionally people make jokes about mobile immunity, that the Native American plates somehow give Native Americans a special kind of legal advantage.
It's one of the things that is really important to recognize in that regard is if you think about Indian nations making treaties with the federal government, Indian nations, as a part of that treaty-making process and the majority of the history of the United States of America, were fully recognized as distinct sovereign governmental entities. The United States made hundreds and hundreds of treaties with Indian nations. And so that kind of distinct nature made it essentially on a government-to-government relationship with the federal government, and the state governments were considered not a part of that Indian nation. So anything that happened within the Indian nation was separate and distinct from the state government. Anything that happened within the state government, the state political boundaries, were distinct from what happened within that Indian nation. They essentially operated as equals in the American federal system. The primary relationship with the Indian nations was with the federal government. Whenever, since the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1920s, there was an increasing amount of erosion of that kind of distinct separation between tribal governments and state governments because of the General Allotment Act. So now you have reservations where sometimes the majority of the land base is owned by non-Indian people. The majority of the population is non-Indian. What do you do with those non-Indian individuals within reservation boundaries? The state government increasingly asserted jurisdictional control over those and over that land base, over those people and over that land base. And so as it moved forward to the present day, there's a great deal of confusion about who has jurisdiction over what parcel of land for what purpose. Does the tribe, does the state, does the federal government? And that's where you get into a conversation about Public Law 280.
Okay, Public Law 280 essentially forced the tribes and states to interact? And does that sort of precede the whole negotiation over casino kind of stuff?
It does and it doesn't,
okay.
Right? So after the Indian Reorganization Act, in the 50s, you have this era where the federal government was attempting to terminate every Indian nation, just completely terminate them and get rid of them, right? So that kind of policy of termination kind of ended up in the state of Minnesota in a unique sort of way. As a part of that policy of termination, the federal government passed legislation called Public Law 280. And what Public Law 280 did is it gave certain states, including Minnesota, California, and 5 others, right? So 7 in total. It gave certain states the same authority that the federal government would have in regards to those Indian nations as far as civil regulatory control was concerned. So the criminal regulatory authority was kept in the federal government in Minnesota. But the state of Minnesota asserts all federal civil jurisdictional authority within reservation boundaries over everybody, right? Indians and non-Indians alike. So within the state of Minnesota, the issues around licensing, any number of different civil regulatory jurisdictional issues, that is governed by the state of Minnesota. but it comes out of a 1950s termination policy of the federal government that the Indian nations should really be subsumed within those state governmental structures.
So does tribal law really mean anything then? If the state has complete control over civil?
The state has federal control over civil regulatory jurisdiction within the boundaries.
Okay, that's a big scoop,
Right?
isn't it? Yeah.
But the tribes still have all of the jurisdictional control, all of the regulatory control as a sovereign nation that they had at any time in the past, right? So all of the treaties within tribal governments, with tribal governments that establish those reservation boundaries and affirm the existence of those Indian nations are still intact. Every Indian nation in the state of Minnesota has all of the sovereign authority that they would have had with or without Public Law 280. And so that's where you get an incredible amount of confusion about what this really means. What does it mean in practice? And historically, within the state of Minnesota, most of the Indian nations in the state kind of really didn't develop their full jurisdictional authority in the way that other nations, Indian nations in other states did. For example, where I come from, the Oglala Sioux tribe, we've had our tribal justice system, our court system, our judicial system, our legislature and executive office and other branches of government actively engaging and passing laws and resolutions and really developing those systems. States or Indian nations within Minnesota have not developed those systems as actively as others because of Public Law 280, because of the confusion about what regulatory control do they really have in relation to the state and what do they not have.
Okay.
And so that also is part of the confusion about whether Indian people have to, for example, pay state taxes or tribal taxes or federal taxes. You know, this kind of prejudice or idea that Indian people get a free ride that you asked about, that they don't have to pay taxes. All of that is completely untrue. Indian people within those reservation boundaries, they pay tribal taxes and they pay federal taxes. If they live outside of those reservation boundaries, they pay state taxes and federal taxes. If you were required to pay a tribal tax doing the work that you do here in St. Paul, that wouldn't be fair. What would be the fairness in that? Similarly, an Indian person earning their living within a reservation in Minnesota and not having to pay state taxes is the same sort of idea.
Okay. In case you're just joining us, I'm talking to Terry Janis, a program officer with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. Terry, I want to talk some about the casinos because that so much drives public perception of who Native Americans are. And we have the second biggest casino in America in Mystic Lake and several other very successful ones, but we also have some pretty impoverished areas around the state.
Yeah.
How did that imbalance come to be, and how does it really color how the basic Anglo culture, particularly in the metro area, perceive Native Americans?
You know, unfortunately, it colors everything in a variety of different ways. I mean, money talks in this country, and big money talks in a big way, right?
Yeah.
But the way I think about it, I come, as I said before, from the Pine Ridge Reservation, and you may hear about it from time to time, and primarily the way people hear about the Pine Ridge Reservation, it is the poorest county, the poorest place in the country, consistently, right? Casino revenues and casino monies haven't touched us at all. And when I live here and have good friends at Prairie Island and good friends at Shakopee, the way I engage them is the way I engage any other, a Cargill or an Erickson or anybody else who comes from a family that has made wealth in this country, right? It's their business, it's their productivity, and they've made it in the way that they've made it. Their families and their children benefit from that legacy. And the Indian nations that have been lucky in order to have successful gaming operations, whether it be Mystic Lake or Prairie Island or Foxwoods or whoever else, that they've had that success as a result of decisions that they made, a vision that they had in putting those casino operations together, fighting the legal battles that they had to fight in order to establish it and make it work for them, negotiating politically and otherwise the way they've had to do. And so they've established these business enterprises. Those have been in business enterprises in some situations, really a relatively small number of situations, you know, a handful or more, have been wildly successful like that. And, you know, good for them.
And it's mostly in direct proximity to the to major population centers. Yeah.
And what you see in each of those areas is because they're very close to major urban areas, historically their population is very small. The story about the Dakota tribes close to the Twin Cities areas is tragic, really,
Because it's so small?
Because the reason why their population base is so small is because of the history in Minnesota of Dakota people being just completely pushed out of Minnesota,